Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, Assistant Sports Editor for Multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State football chat by Joel Haas of the Daily Collegian and the Post-Gazette, reacting to Penn State making the college football playoff, officially getting a number 6 seed facing SMU in the first round, then potentially Boise State in the quarterfinals. We put a lot of time into talking about where they might end up, and sure enough, they ended close to where I think Joel and I thought that they would. Obviously, there was a loss in the Big Ten title game to Oregon along the way, so we're going to break that down. I think the big topic for the day is how much pressure is on James Franklin and Penn State as a program now. Obviously, the big game bugaboo has been something that's been with them all season for multiple seasons. And now you get a favorable draw to get into the Final Four. What's at stake and what does Penn State need to accomplish to silence some of those critics over this next month? We're going to get into all of that. Before we do, just want to thank our sponsor. It's Voodoo Brewing Company, State College. Enjoy world-renowned craft beer, delicious cocktails, and our almost famous lobster roll at Voodoo Brewing Company, State College Pub, located right off College Avenue and Route 322 at 201 Elmwood Street, State College. VBC has something exciting going on every day of the week. Join us this fall on Mondays for weekly free play cornhole tournaments, or test your knowledge with pub trivia every Tuesday at 6. Wednesdays are game night featuring board games, card games, and adult games. Every Thursday, your boy Dots hosts bingo, but this is not your Nana's bingo. Saturday, we have your Nittany Lions and college football on all day. We finish off Sundays with our weekly brunch paired with Steelers, Eagles, and Red Zone coverage. Can't wait to see you at the VBC State College Pub. Okay, Joel, let's get into it with James Franklin. How much pressure is on him now? You lose in the title game, but you end up with this favorable path. I think Penn State's going to be favored by more than a touchdown in both of these games. I think I got an email from one of the offshores that said, if they advance to face Boise State, that spread would be even bigger than the first round. I think they had it 11.5. I think a lot of people would have preferred to take the path that they have as opposed to winning the Big Ten title and having to face the winner of Ohio State versus Tennessee. I think that a flag flies forever, and that's why I think I would have preferred to see them win the Big Ten championship. But there are a lot of people who said, get the best draw to get to the national championship. They have it. So what does James Franklin have to do to keep the heat off himself, given the opportunity that's been put in front of the Nittany Lions?
Yeah, I think short answer, you need 2 wins minimum. You mentioned it. Penn State, should be favored pretty heavily in both these games. I think it's 8.5 for SMU and then 11.5. I think is what I've seen as well for Boise State in a potential second round matchup. And James Franklin never likes to look ahead or anything like that, but I think you have to be expecting at least a semifinals appearance. And even then, if you do get to the semifinals, you're probably playing Georgia, which is a team that's missing Carson Beck at quarterback, or potentially Notre Dame, which might be the better opponent who comes out of kind of that region. But regardless, that's even a winnable game, I think, as well. So for Penn State, you're avoiding Oregon and Ohio State and Texas until the finals. Like, you don't have to play any of those teams until potentially in the finals. And I think those are arguably the 3 best teams in the bracket. So obviously there's probably some problems with, how the playoff is formatted currently. But I think if you're Penn State, minimum 2 wins and potentially even a 3rd win.
How much pressure is on Penn State from a program perspective? Think about the path that they have in front of them. And like you mentioned, I think you can make a very solid case that they should be a pick'em to get to the championship game. Whether they can win it or not, it's a different conversation. But, I think from a roster perspective, the guys you have that are your stars all can go to the NFL this year if they want. You're thinking about Nick Singleton, Kaytron Allen, Drew Allar, Abdul Carter. Now, whether they'll all go, whether NIL factors into keeping them in Happy Valley, that's all for well down the road. But do you look at Penn State as a team and say, for the next handful of years, this is the best obvious roster that they might have, and that almost certainly you're going to lose guys that are bona fide future NFL talents, and that it might take some time to retool if you can't get the job done here. Do you look at that situation and say Penn State, not just for James Franklin's sake, but as institutionally, the guys in that locker room, they got to get the most out of this moment after, and this is a point that I made. They've had bad luck in so many years past, falling just short against some of these big name teams. Finally, they're getting some good luck on their side. right? And does that heighten the pressure on this team to get the job done to some extent?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a really good point there where if you look at kind of the way Penn State's been recruiting, obviously they kind of stay in that 10 to 20 range pretty consistently, but that 2022 class with Drew Allar, Nick Singleton, Kaytron Allen, Abdul Carter, Kevin Winston Jr., a bunch of those big name guys, and obviously Cage is injured right now and has been since I think week 2, but regardless, a lot of your main stars are from that 2022 class, which was ranked number 6 in the country. This is their junior season. And so, like you mentioned, a lot of them have a decision to make. My guess would be, some of them will leave, some of them will return. We'll kind of get, I think, a mixed bag there in terms of how many of them do end up coming back for next year, but none of them are guaranteed to return. And a lot of them do have NFL futures. And so, in that sense, yeah, I think this team will experience somewhat of a fall off next season just because, again, Penn State has recruited, pretty well, but the last couple of cycles have been ranked, I think, like 15th nationally for the last few years. And, that's still good. That's still solid. But I don't think you've seen the same amount of talent that you have in that 2022 recruiting class. So you're definitely losing a ton of guys and kind of projecting to the future. It's, you look at this roster, I could be wrong. I don't think there are any freshman starters for Penn State this season. And there's certainly some talented pieces. A guy like Cooper Cousins, who we've seen a little bit of, Tyrese Mills at safety, who's played a decent amount. But in terms of guys who are, stepping in and immediately starting, you don't have that, that Nick Singleton, that Abdul Carter who's come in and done that. So I think, obviously that's kind of a problem for the future where you don't want to worry about that until, the end of the season and you figure out kind of who's coming back. And that's kind of an off-season conversation that Penn State will have to have. But yeah, they're going to be losing a ton of pieces after this year. And so I think there is sort of that sense of urgency where it's, if not now, then when. And even on top of that, 2022 class, you've got guys who are like Devon Ellis, who, may or may not have an NFL future, but he's in his 6th year, like he's been with this program a long time. And really he hasn't had a big win in those 6 years, unless you want to count, maybe the Rose Bowl, but certainly not, of the magnitude of a playoff win. And so I think there are a lot of guys on this team who I think are desperate to get a win and to kind of go out the right way. I think maybe it could determine who chooses to leave and come back. I think if, Penn State finishes strong and wins, say, 2-3 games in the playoffs, maybe has a competitive loss in the semifinals or finals, maybe guys feel comfortable leaving. Maybe if Penn State gets upset in the first round of the playoffs, guys maybe kind of take that personally, have a bit of a chip on their shoulder and choose to come back next year. So there's almost kind of a catch-22 situation potentially for Penn State. But I certainly think this is a big year in terms of, what you're losing after the season.
And obviously the name we didn't mention, Tyler Warren, almost certainly gone to the NFL. Joel, I also wanted to ask it from this perspective. We talk about this big game James label. Do you look at the situation with Georgia and wonder if it's not going to take a national championship outright for him to shake the label that beating a hobbled Georgia team in the semifinals hypothetically still might not change things in the critics' eyes about Penn State? I almost feel like the path is so clear for them that if they don't at least get to the championship game, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny. And I would argue even if they lost the championship game, that you'd still have a lot of these same people saying, well, big game James can't win, can't beat really good teams whenever he's presented with them and has to kind of rely on, I think you mentioned the Rose Bowl. Penn State kind of backed into that Rose Bowl. And I think a lot of people are talking about this team in the same way of having backed into this number 6 seed with a nice path. What's your read on nationally what this game means for James Franklin, more so than I think within the program? Because I think you're right that if he wins a couple of games, I think people around the program are generally going to be pretty pleased about that, having not made the playoff in these 10 years. But I think the national conversation is always different. And I think a lot of these big critics are going to be focusing on James Franklin pretty much down to the end of the season if he doesn't kind of get that signature win.
Yeah, I can already see the headlines now where Penn State makes a run to the finals and loses to whoever, Oregon, Texas, whoever it may be, and people are saying, well, Penn State only won because or made it that far because they're playing an ACC school and then a Group of Five school, and then Georgia without its starting quarterback, and all of a sudden the excuses are going to seem to flow in from the other side about why Penn State was able to win those games. I don't think nationally people are going to consider at least either of these first two games big games. Georgia maybe will kind of get that consideration, and maybe it'll be Notre Dame instead. But I think that third game is kind of the key in terms of changing the narrative. I just don't think James will get kind of the respect that he necessarily deserves for beating these first two opponents. And look, these are playoff teams. These are teams that were in their conference championship game. Boise won it. SMU almost won it. Probably should have won it. And these are still good teams, but they just aren't viewed the same way because of the conference they play in. And again, with a kind of a big spread like this, it goes back to Franklin not being able to win in big games. Well, all of those big games, Penn State has been an underdog, and obviously Penn State's a pretty sizable favorite for both these first two games. So I don't think they would do anything to kind of change that narrative. They're also not top 5 opponents, so that statistic is still gonna it's still gonna be a pretty terrible record against top 5 teams. I think it's that third game that it's really going to come down to. In terms of kind of changing the way that people look at the program. And I think that would be the big one for Penn State.
Yeah, I agree with you, Joel. Let's get into this. What do you think the recruiting impact of this next month could be? Not just in terms of making the playoff, because I think that's one thing, but you're talking about the potential for 3-4 games that you're in front of recruits for the next month, where many teams are playing one or none, across the Big Ten. You mentioned that the recruiting rankings have slipped a little bit since 22, since this, highly rated class came in. I believe the class that was signed last week was 17th, something like that. How much value is there in playing for a long time? Because this is kind of an unknown, but I would think that, being kind of in the spotlight for so long in so many different games, could give Penn State a real boost. And you even look to last week, they flipped the tight end from Michigan just seemingly by getting to the Big Ten championship game. Obviously, that conversation was more complicated than Penn State just backing into the Big Ten title game. But it still kind of lends credence to the narrative that the more of these big games you play, the better it is for recruiting, and that this year may be the best year to have ever made it, because it's the first year of the 12 teams, and you're going to get a lot of extra games instead of just a bowl game and then maybe a championship appearance out of it.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly helps. Obviously, everyone wants to go to a good team that's winning games, and especially winning big games. I think fans tend to kind of over exaggerate the impact that a single game result can have on recruiting. I think maybe Penn State loses to Ohio State or whatever, and fans are kind of thinking that that's going to somehow sway some recruits. I think those types of relationships, especially the way that Penn State recruits, where Penn State's a very relationship based university, just in terms of its approach to recruiting. And it was interesting because during the week leading up to the Oregon game, all of the Penn State assistants were actually working on recruiting because they had National Signing Day coming up and things like that. And so we had media, and we got to talk to some of the recruiting personnel, like Andy Frank and Kenny Sanders, a few of the guys who are kind of responsible for recruiting, and kind of learn more about Penn State's strategy. And it's definitely, and Franklin talks about this a lot as well, but it's very relationship based. Penn State likes to get to know these guys. And if anyone watched the National Signing Day live stream that they do on Twitter, Franklin they do their fake NFL draft thing where they play the chime and they act like Penn State's drafting these guys, and then they bring them up on Zoom or FaceTime or whatever. If the families can even figure out how to get the camera set up, which seems to be an issue still in 2024. But regardless, it's very obvious because these guys commit, and James will ask what went into this decision, kind of give them their chance to speak, and then he'll go to how about dad? Do you have anything to say? Mom, do you have anything to say? Brother, do you have anything to say? And if they've got a younger sibling who's maybe sitting there for National Signing Day, he'll joke with them. We could use you in a few years if you keep putting in the work, things like that. He definitely and James is very good about this, where he builds those bonds, especially with the parents. I know a lot of the parents of players really like the program and are big fans of Franklin, and he does a good job of kind of selling them. And also 247 Sports does a good job of of, tracking these recruits, obviously with the rankings and everything like that. But they also have a timeline feature where you can see, which schools are offering this guy, where is he visiting, and when is it happening, and things like that. And Penn State almost always is one of the first schools to offer, which, can be a bad thing if you offer someone their freshman year of high school and they never really develop and, turns out to be a bust and things like that, but I think Penn State does a really good job of evaluating that talent early, getting in before, an Ohio State, a Michigan, some other competitors, some other, of the big sharks in recruiting. And Penn State does a good job of getting in there first and then kind of building up that relationship, maintaining that relationship. And I think it gives Penn State an advantage when it comes to that. But to get back to the original point, I don't think necessarily single games have a huge impact on, what a recruitment is going to end up like. I think if you kind of have a disaster season, like, maybe what Florida State did this year, where, obviously they have high expectations. They're planning on being in the race for the ACC and finish 2-10. Anytime you have kind of a disaster like that, or, on the opposite end, you're not expected to do much. You look at maybe Arizona State, picked last in the Big 12, ends up winning the conference. There are certain, situations like that where that can maybe sway things. And I think more often than not, you can see classes kind of crumble and fall apart. Where they have a lot of decommits after maybe a bad season. But in terms of on a game-to-game basis, single games don't necessarily have as much of an impact as maybe the average fan would think. But again, it obviously never hurts to win these games. Like, obviously, you want to be winning these playoff games and being on people's TVs for an extra week if you possibly can.
Yeah, I agree. Joel, let me switch gears here and recap the Big Ten title game a little bit. Do you think this team can beat Oregon if it gets another chance? That's question A. Question B is, do you think they have a better chance of beating Oregon in a rematch or Ohio State?
That's tough. I think probably Oregon. Would be easier for Penn State. I tend to believe Ohio State's just the better team top to bottom in terms of talent. Now you can argue about, some questionable, things, and then obviously the Michigan game, which was just a huge implosion on Ohio State's part and really horribly coached. If we're being honest with, just insisting to run the ball against the best defensive line in college football when they have a severe advantage at wide receiver. But I think just talent wise, Ohio State's probably better than Oregon. Now, obviously, Oregon is still loaded on both sides of the ball. We know what they have, especially at wide receiver. And Dylan Gabriel obviously was named the best quarterback in the Big Ten. And defensively, they've got some really good defensive ends. But Penn State, I thought, found a lot of success in that game and kind of shot itself in the foot out of the gate. Obviously, falling behind with I think it was 4 personal foul penalties of 15 yards each to kind of help Oregon out. And obviously, Oregon goes down and scores 3 touchdowns on his first 3 drives. So obviously a pretty bad start for Penn State, but then you look at what happened after that. Penn State was right in that game, going punch for punch in a shootout with Oregon against, Oregon is obviously an offensively led team. Like the offense is the better unit for Oregon, but regardless, that's still a defense loaded with blue chip recruits that has some talented pieces, obviously. And Penn State was really, I thought, matched up well. The offensive line, I was extremely impressed with the way they were able to protect Drew, kind of let him get the ball, and especially the way that they were able to create holes in the run game for Nick and Kaytron, who both went for over 100 yards. And I think Nick had 10.5 yards per carry. Kaytron was 8.9 yards per carry. Just ridiculous numbers in the run game, ridiculous success from Penn State offensively. And I think if they played again, you probably get a similar script where it results in a shootout. And, maybe this time Penn State doesn't fall behind so much early and is able to kind of hang in there and go back and forth and potentially win it.
I tend to agree with you. I think Oregon's the team that I was sitting there in the second half and I said, man, they can score on this team. And if they can score on this team and you believe in this defense to finally start getting some stops, they're going to have a chance to win it. And sure enough, I think they were the better team after Oregon went up four scores. Once they got to 28, I thought Penn State was the better team from that point forward. I don't know that I had that sense in the Ohio State game that Penn State was the better team really at any point. I will say this, though. I do very much wonder what a Penn State-Ohio State rematch would look like, given that they were, down for the count against the number 1 team in the country and threw punches in a way that I don't think we've seen Penn State do in these big games in a handful of years. It very much seems like if the offense can't get things rolling, that they get in their own heads and they don't, kind of throw those haymakers and they just kind of maybe they'll score some points out of desperation late in the game or something like that. But you don't see the confidence that I think we saw in this Big Ten title game. And I very much wonder if you get Penn State in an indoor environment against Ohio State, and it's not at Beaver Stadium, it's not at Ohio Stadium, it's in a neutral setting that kind of lends itself more to, a mindset of like they were in the Big Ten title game. Can you get a different result? Can they be a little bit more resilient? Can some of this energy that surrounded them in these big games against Ohio State and Michigan maybe subside a little bit? I'd be very intrigued to see that matchup, in that setting if it got to that point. Joel, I wanted to ask you about this matchup with SMU because a lot of the pundits are comparing SMU and Oregon in terms of speed and how they play. What will this matchup tell us about Penn State in terms of their ability to have played a game like they did against Oregon, go up against a somewhat similar team in SMU, and adjust and prove that they learned something in that game against Oregon and maybe have something for them down the road?
Yeah, I think scheme-wise, that's probably a pretty fair comparison. SMU kind of likes to do a lot of the same things where it's likes to go quick and kind of get its receivers the ball in space, like you mentioned. I just think, in terms of that comparison, the major difference is 5 stars versus 3 stars, right? I mean, SMU is a school that was a group of 5 school last year, now in the ACC, which is obviously a tier below what you're finding in the Big Ten and SEC. And just in terms of talent, I just don't think they can match up as well. I mean, you just look at like a guy like Tez Johnson for Oregon, who just had a ridiculous game of whatever it was, 11 catches, 150. Like SMU doesn't have a guy like that. You know what I mean? Like they have a wide receiver one who's, good, but just in terms of that elite talent, I just think that's where SMU is lacking. And the scheme partially can make up for that, but at the end of the day, just the talent on the field, Penn State has such a significant advantage. And if you go back through the recent recruiting classes and things like that, I think, it becomes pretty obvious that there's a discrepancy on the field in terms of talent. That's, why Penn State is favored. But yeah, in terms of style of play, I think Penn State learned a lot. I think it was able to adjust somewhat toward the end of that game against Oregon. Obviously 3 touchdowns on the first 3 drives. I think 4 touchdowns on the first 5 drives. And then after that, kind of settling in. I mean, again, Oregon was still scoring points as the game went on. But the defense, I think, found a way to get stops at times, especially. And I think when Penn State did get stops, it was because that defensive line was getting in there, getting pressure. Tackles for loss were huge, kind of getting Oregon off schedule because obviously a team that likes to go fast, if you can get them off schedule, it kind of throws them out of rhythm, things like that. They have to start slowing down, taking their time. And then that gives the defense the advantage. So I think if you're Penn State, you can certainly follow that blueprint. You want to find what was working against Oregon in the later stages and kind of try and repeat that against SMU.
Is Boise State a bigger problem for Penn State than people are giving them credit for? I mean, they just got run through by Oregon. I think both backs for Oregon went for 80-plus yards in the Big Ten title game. Ashton Jeanty is a dude. I mean, there's no other way to say it. I'm not saying that I'm going to pick Boise to beat Penn State or anything, but could they be a tougher matchup than maybe they're being given credit for?
Yeah. I mean, I think, all you really need to know is Boise State lost to Oregon by 3 points earlier in the season. And I could see kind of a similar situation playing out where it ends up being almost a shootout. And obviously that's, a heavy dose of Ashton Jeanty if he's able to find success. I think Penn State matches up pretty well just because I don't know if Penn State's allowed really any running back to have much sustained success against it. That defensive line has been pretty great against the run this season. And I think, Penn State does a really good job scheme-wise there. I think the linebackers are probably better at defending the run than defending the pass. And so I think, in that regard, Penn State should be kind of well-suited to stop Jeanty. But, at a certain point, no team has really been able to stop him so far. And I don't know if Penn State will necessarily be the first. I think, he's obviously a Heisman level talent who will be kind of unstoppable to an extent. And so if you're Penn State, I think, your biggest advantage in that game is probably trying to just score on every drive because Oregon, again, to a certain point, Oregon's just going to get points. That's what they do. And obviously heavily relying on Ashton Jeanty, but even some of their wide receivers, I've gotten to watch a few games. I was pretty impressed by their wide receivers as well. And their offense as a whole, I think, moves the ball well. So they will score points. I think if you're Penn State, you want to take advantage of that Boise State defense. And, every time you touch the ball, you want to be putting up points.
Where's Drew Allar right now in your mind, Joel? Moved the ball against Oregon, looked unafraid, but obviously throws two pivotal interceptions. The one that set up the one touchdown that arguably is the difference in the game with Penn State's inability to generate a turnover. Then the one that ended the final drive that I think was frustrating for a lot of people. You and I talked, I believe, in the preseason about can you tolerate more mistakes from Drew Allar this season? To maybe get more results, on a drive-to-drive basis. And I think the Big Ten title game was a microcosm of it in that way, and that he was moving the ball and was taking chances and doing it against a really good team. But the other side of it was he did make a couple really costly mistakes. What is your read on him and his ability to bounce back from this loss, learn from it, and translate the things that were going well in the Big Ten title game into this playoff run?
Yeah, that was kind of a really interesting game for him. I think it was almost the opposite of what we've typically seen from Drew, where he's more on the conservative side, and he's been a little bit better about that this year. In terms of going downfield, there's all sorts of stats about how he's been more successful on throws of 10+ yards and things like that. I thought that was the biggest example of it was on Saturday. It was an interesting performance because obviously, the two interceptions, like you mentioned, neither of them were necessarily great throws. The first one, I think you could have argued that Khalil Dinkins is being held on that first throw and then ends up being a little bit behind him and into the defensive back's arms. Regardless, it was a pretty bad throw anyway, because, he was pretty well covered by the guy. And then obviously the second one was kind of just taking a shot downfield. I don't necessarily blame Drew for that because it was more of a 50-50 ball where the defensive back, I'm blanking on his name, but made a really great catch on the ball actually, with kind of diving backwards to bring that one in. So I think the second one is more excusable than the first one in terms of those interceptions. And then also his completion percentage was near 50%. I think he was 20 for 39, which is obviously this season has been really good with accuracy. I think his completion percentage was like top 5 or 6 nationally heading into that game. I haven't checked what it is now, but I assume he's dropped a little bit after that because, again, he was near 50% passing. So obviously there's kind of some ugly statistics, but there were also some really impressive throws in that game. I think of the one to Tyler Warren that he kind of layered, over the second level under the safety to kind of squeeze in there to Warren, and then obviously a great catch from Warren. I think of that late touchdown on fourth down. I believe to Harrison Wallace there in the end zone, really tight window with an Oregon defender kind of pulling on his jersey as he makes the throw. And James Franklin was asked kind of about Drew's performance, how he would evaluate it. And he said he thought there were 5 or 6 plays during that game from Drew that were the best he's seen from any quarterback he's coached. So like the highs from that game were some of the best quarterback play that Franklin says he's seen coaching college quarterbacks. Obviously the lows, were pretty bad. I don't think there were necessarily too many misses. You could point at the interceptions. I think there were some catchable balls as well. I know Tyler Warren had a couple that he kind of juggled, didn't haul in. I think Liam Clifford had one on the first drive of the game that he should have brought in. So I think the completion percentage maybe is a little bit more on the receivers, but Allar flashed. I mean, he showed some things that were really, really impressive, really good throws that I think NFL scouts are going to be kind of drooling over. And so that was really interesting to see. And again, it was a more aggressive play style than what we've seen from him, but he needed to do that. Penn State was down, I think 28-10 at one point. And he needed to kind of air out the ball, play more aggressively, and things like that down the stretch. So I think he kind of rose to the occasion and he realized that. And I think it bodes well for Penn State going forward that he's shown the ability to do that.
Yeah, I thought those two throws to Tyler Warren in particular were really good. That Warren ends up dropping, and maybe the whole game is different if either one of those is caught. Not to pile on Tyler Warren at all. Obviously, he's a big reason that Penn State got where they were, but particularly from a Drew Allar perspective, he gave him a great chance to make a big play on the ball, and he just didn't, and that hurt. And you can't necessarily put that on Drew, and you can't put it on the box score either, and the completion percentage and all that. It was somewhat evocative of the Peach Bowl last season, Joel, where he kind of had a similar line, I think. But they never lost contact with Oregon the way they did with Ole Miss in that game. And I think the way he played was a lot more garbage time stats in that one, as opposed to this was a competitive game throughout. Obviously, they were down 18 at one point, but They bounced back pretty quickly, and Oregon's ones were in the game the whole time. There was no question what was going on there. So I think in that way, I think he took a step from a year ago when he was in that game in Atlanta. Joel, do you have any concern about the ticket situation? I've seen it percolating a little bit on social media how there were wide swaths of tickets available as late as yesterday evening. I checked Ticketmaster today. It looks like it's a lot more patchy in terms of where the tickets are available. Honestly, looks more like a normal home game. And I'm sure with 2 weeks to build up to this, people are getting Christmas presents. I think it's going to be okay, but I know that there was a lot of consternation specifically about how the student section was trimmed a little bit to make room for general ticket buyers. Do you have any concern that this is going to be a 110, 111,000 seat or people crowd? What's your read on what you've seen from that situation? What you've heard from maybe some students who expected to get tickets and maybe did not?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've heard like some really mixed reports in terms of especially the student section where a lot of students supposedly requested tickets and then were denied. And then you look at, what tickets are available, and there are a ton in kind of those upper levels of kind of the area that's traditionally the student section. And so, and I know it's the college football playoff that's in charge of kind of handling the ticketing, which first of all, I think is BS because the college football playoff is the one making revenue. Penn State's not making any revenue off the tickets for this game. And they're also in charge of, selling them, distributing them. And I thought they did a good job, at least with the ticket pricing, because for the students, it was only $28 for a ticket. And then even now, if you go look, I think there's a lot of tickets available for $100, which is really not bad for, a college football playoff game. The date obviously has a little bit of impact on the game being 4 days before Christmas. So obviously it's tough for some people who are going home, especially people who live, multiple states away or potentially are international and are, flying long ways away. Obviously they're not just going to be able to come back like that for a game. But in terms of how it'll look on Saturday, I don't think I would be worried. You can look at kind of what's available right now in terms of the market and see that there are definitely large, areas that are unaccounted for. But I think, this Penn State fan base, typically you look at, what it's been able to do, especially for big games where, big games always sell out at Beaver Stadium, like regardless of the situation. It can be 10 degrees, but if Ohio State's coming, that game's selling out. That game's going to be packed, potentially an attendance record, things like that. I tend not to worry at this point, at least. I mean, maybe, we check back in a week and potentially it's still a bad situation where there's still, whatever, a quarter of the stadium looks like it's going to be empty. But I tend to believe that the Penn State fans will get that place packed by kickoff.
Joel, I'll ask one more question on the atmosphere, and then I got a question about KJ Winston. Brady Quinn made a little jab at Penn State for announcing the playoff game as a noon whiteout. And he tweeted at them, he said, excited to see more noon whiteouts in the future. And obviously, to the extent Penn State has a rival, I do believe it is Big Noon Saturday. The fans don't like them. It's somewhat becoming clear that Big Noon doesn't like Penn State. But they don't really have a choice because they created this mess and they want the audience. So what do you make of Brady Quinn? And do you think Penn State's going to cave to Fox for regular season games in the future just because they're doing a noon whiteout for a playoff? I say no. I think you still keep that cat and mouse game going, for as many years as you can pull it off. But and that really just would add fuel to my fire if I'm Pat Kraft and making these decisions.
Yeah. That was kind of crazy. Obviously, it was a little bit of a satirical comment. I think it's important to note that regardless of whether Penn State officially made this a whiteout, it would have been a whiteout regardless. But yeah, obviously having the whiteout at noon is different, and it's something that Penn State tries to avoid. But for a playoff game, I think that's kind of the exception. It kind of calls for that whiteout atmosphere, and even looking ahead to next year's schedule, which was recently released. I think Oregon is by far the biggest home game that Penn State has. It's really a similar situation for Penn State to a lot of the previous years where you've got a couple good opponents. You've got Oregon and Ohio State on the schedule. And then outside of that, it should be relatively easy wins for Penn State. And Ohio State's going to be on the road next year. And so really there's one big game for Penn State. It's Oregon. It comes early in the year. It's actually the Big Ten opener for Penn State. And that game has, Big Noon written all over it. But I also think you have to kind of fold and make that a whiteout anyway. So just in terms of, the whiteouts at night, I think, this one maybe sets the precedent for heading into next year, because I think that Oregon game next year, regardless of whether it's at noon, I think that game has to be your whiteout. Just because, I can run through real quick. You have Indiana, but that's, I believe, a November game. And then outside of that, you've got Northwestern and Nebraska are the other choices. And then there's going to be 5 Big Ten road games. And so out of that group, I think, Oregon far and away should be the whiteout. And so I think, this is potentially just kind of setting the precedent for that. But I think it will be a thing in the future. I think it's unavoidable. Obviously, both sides have kind of refused to yield up to this point, but I think Penn State at the end of the day is going to be the one that has to kind of yield a little bit.
We'll see, Joel. We'll see. I'll be amused to see, because I would imagine Oregon would have plenty of incentive to fight for that game not to be at noon as well, because that would be a 9 a.m. Eastern kick for them, and I think you could argue that's a pretty significant disadvantage for such a huge game. So I think both teams are going to say put it on CBS, put it on NBC later in the day. We'll see if they prevail. And I'll also say this, Joel, if one of these two programs wins the national championship, I think that puts Fox in a pretty disadvantageous position with regard to this conversation as well, because you're going to tell the national champs that they got to play at 9 a.m. Eastern in a whiteout, stadium? I don't know. I'll be curious to see how that plays out. Excited for that summer fodder. Get you out of here on this, Joel. KJ Winston officially done for the season. Was back in for the Big Ten title game, but they've pretty much ruled him out for the rest of the way. I think a lot of Penn State's postseason case, to be a national championship contender, was the hope that you'd get this guy back. What impact is it now on this defense and after a game where they kind of got torched by Oregon that you're not going to see him in a Penn State uniform, at least for the rest of 2024?
Yeah, he's obviously been a huge piece of the team, but at this point he's been out for such a long time, and I think this was kind of the expectation. I think if you could kind of read between the tea leaves, it was kind of obvious that he wasn't going to be back this season. Franklin obviously called it a long-term injury way back in week 2, week 3 when he went down, and then I think it was at some point during player media, one of the players kind of leaked that Kevin Winston Jr. was no longer with the team in terms of being on campus and things like that. I think one of the players mentioned something about how he was at home with his parents and taking Zoom classes. So he wasn't even, with the team at that point midway through the season. And I think after that, it kind of became obvious that, okay, he's probably out, at least, until very late in the playoffs. And then obviously James Franklin recently confirms that he won't be returning to the team. I think they were kind of holding off a little bit of hope there as long as they could. It's obviously a very talented player who was, projected as a first-round pick heading into the season, and had a pretty good start to the season, big game against West Virginia, I believe. But they've been playing 11 games now without him. And I think the defense has, for the most part looked well. Obviously kind of got torched against Oregon. And you could obviously speculate how that may have been different if he had potentially been, guarding Tez Johnson or something like that. But I think it is what it is at this point. And you've been playing so long without him that at this point, the players know what role they're going to play. And it's not like you're having to adjust on the fly to a player who just went down. It's you were hoping to get him back, but regardless, what you have without him, and you still have a lot of talent back there. I think of Tyrese Mills, the freshman who's kind of stepped up in a big way. Elliott Washington, who's been dinged up a little bit, but has played well at corner as kind of that fifth defensive back. So I still think Penn State will be okay. Obviously, you would love to have KJ, but I think it's been a long enough time without him that you kind of have things figured out back there.
Well, Joel, I know you're going to get to a final, so enjoy that. Everyone else, please subscribe to the channel. We got a lot more Penn State content coming your way. We'll be back next week breaking down this matchup with SMU in a little bit more detail. So subscribe to the channel. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm. We always appreciate that. Plenty more Steelers-Eagles coverage coming at you on this channel as well. Obviously, a big week in the pro ranks for Pennsylvania teams as well. So join us for the ride, and we will talk to you again next week.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.